Today's guest is our good friend, Dr. Sam Nicholson, here to explain how anyone can study philosophy fruitfully.
Welcome to Homeschooling Saints, the podcast that helps you create the homeschool you love for the people you love. Our host is Lisa Mladinich, a Catholic life coach, TV host, best-selling author, and an instructor at Homeschool Connections.
Before we get started, remember to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. And if you're watching on YouTube, click the bell to join our channel. Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa Mladinich, your host, and Dr. Sam Nicholson is here to explain how anyone can study philosophy fruitfully. What an exciting topic. Welcome to the program, Dr. Nicholson.
Thank you for having me back.
Oh, yeah, it's so much fun, always. So interesting. So you are truly a treasured member of the faculty here at Homeschool Connections. So you teach courses, you do a lot, you're a homeschool dad with a big family, but you're also a published academic with very impressive credentials. So people like me with no formal training can feel a little bit intimidated by this topic. Would you mind just helping us over that obstacle?
Yeah. Well, first of all, one of the things that one of the most impressive professors and instructors that I ever had said to me, there were a couple of things he said to me. And the first one was that if you cannot explain this in a way that the average person with no background can understand, then that means that you don't understand it. And then the other thing that stuck with me, and this was a little bit more pointed, is he said that you can make a bird bath look as deep as the ocean if you simply make it muddy enough. And so he put a prize, a premium on clarity of expression and really being able to explain ideas in a way that the average person could see the impact and relevance of it. And so I've always taken that to heart. And I've always been aware that there are many people who have advanced degrees who sound impressive, but are not impressive. And that I had better make sure that I'm not in that category.
I love that. I feel like that's very Christ-like, even if your professor was not a religious person.
Oh, he was. Yes. That was part of what made it so impactful when he said that.
Wonderful. Because you hear the honesty and the purity of intention of willing the good of the other, not trying to lord something over someone else or bar them from comprehension just to puff yourself up, right? Which is what we can feel sometimes around academics, whether they mean to do it or not. They speak their own jargon and all that kind of stuff. We can feel a little bit shut out. So I love those two images. That's so amazing. The bird bath and the idea that if you can't explain it clearly, then you don't understand it yourself. Those are just so good, so useful. So there's hope for us. So what are some of the things that we can gain from studying philosophy for ourselves?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I'll start with an anecdote, is that I help out at the OCI program in our parish, and we have an atheist couple who's coming in. And they've always been sort of left coast, politically active people on the far left end of the political spectrum. And what prompted them to take an interest in Catholicism, and by way of extension, sort of the philosophy behind it, is just their experience with some of the insanity in the culture, in particular, some of the stuff with the gender theory, with some of the woke stuff that's going on right now. And what they've described is they've just said that we're living through an age of institutionalized unreason. And there are questions that we are now having to pursue that we have never, ever been forced to think about. And it's by looking at some of these things and being forced to ask sort of really basic questions about what a person is and what it means to live a good life, they've come to an interest in philosophy. And one of the good things about being Catholic is that we have all of this tradition and spiritual expertise that we can rely upon without having to reason our way to it. But if we take the effort to do that, to actually do some of the intellectual work, then we can enrich our own practice and appreciation of the faith. And I think we can make it real in a way that just goes beyond just the surface.
Yeah, I love that. This may be overly simplistic, so feel free to course correct me a little bit. But I'm just suddenly having this sense that because I'm a coach in my professional life, there's so much out there about finding your why, about getting down to the absolute kernel of what calls you, what motivates you. And so I feel like there's a little bit of a cultural zeitgeist right now that might be an opportunity for the philosophy, the underpinnings of our faith to what's the real reason? What's the process that leads us to that point that we can actually grasp?
Yeah. And I think that part of it is that we're in an odd situation culturally where within our lifetime, so I just turned 45. And so I have cultural Christianity within living memory. But the kind of cultural Christianity that I grew up with was not intellectually rigorous. Nobody really understood, the whys of why we believed what we did, or people did not have a lot of curiosity about sort of the historical origins of the faith and why we believe what we believe. And we've lived through this sort of precipitous collapse in the culture where it seems as if we've lost our collective minds. We've seen this sort of cultural Christianity sort of run out of gas and then just kind of falter. And I think we're at a moment where enough people can see that there is something deeply wrong and unwell about the way people are living, and that we've got to get to the bottom of what has happened and why that is. And I'm seeing a lot of people, particularly young people, who are now attracted to the faith, and what they want is something that has real weight and depth. And they realize that they cannot simply rely upon just the cultural forms that we've all just inherited and grew up with to supply them with that meaning and with that insight.
Yes, they've been pandered to and sold slop instead of, the richness of intellectual life. They've been so talked down to and given safe spaces and all that nonsense. I really think they're starving. I really think that that's why we're seeing such a resurgence. I'm part of an RCIA program in our parish. We are really seeing more and more young people pouring back into these programs. So praise the Lord for that hunger. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And in the OCI program that we're running, I've seen a huge shift in a very short period of time, where the typical person who came into OCI, we call it OCIA now as opposed to RCIA, although I think RCIA rolls off the tongue, better. But it used to be that it was converts from Protestantism. And they would typically be people who got interested in the history of the church, and they had maybe 4 or 5 objections, all centering around Mary, purgatory, the papacy, etc. And OCIA was a place where they worked through those objections and they sort of got over their hurdles. Now I'm seeing an increasing number of people who have no background whatsoever, who are unbaptized, and they're either looking for something or, and this is what I referenced earlier, they're repelled by the visible sickness that they can see in the culture. They can see that there is something clearly not right, that there are many people who are unwell and unbalanced, and that this is simply no way to live. And even if they still have all of these intellectual objections to Christianity and Catholicism particularly, they can see that there is something worth having that people who live out the faith have and that other people lack. And they, in some cases, see it as something that is not necessarily intellectual. It's just, I can see that there is something wrong with these people who have imbibed the culture as it currently stands. And I can see that there is something right with people who are attempting to live a serious Catholic life. And I want to be amongst them.
I love
sort of
that.
Pre-intellectual.
Yes, I love that. That's so beautiful because it's a purely human response. It's a noticing on a level they maybe not have words for yet, that there's something there that's of value that's drawing their hearts. So beautiful. So there's a lot of complexity to where philosophy can be found and can be valuable in our lives. And so our audience is primarily Catholic, but there's also others listening. So what's most important as far as just a beginning to approaching philosophy for a layperson?
Yeah. So I think it's the first you have to appreciate that you are an intellectual creature as well as a spiritual creature. Your intellect is part of your God-given constitution, and that you're made to know truth.
Yeah.
And it's not just that you're made to know the truth, but you're made to understand it and to contemplate it and to appreciate it. And there are a bunch of different ways in which you can go about doing that. But one of them is through the process of taking very basic ideas and thinking them through in a way that yields novel insight. And philosophy at its best permits us to do that. And when it's done properly, and when it's done in the service of the spiritual life, it can help us grow and develop. And it can help us to see things that we would not be able to see with our unaided sort of mind's eye, as it were.
I can almost feel God smiling as you're saying, yields a novel insight. Like I can imagine the brain lighting up in all sorts of fascinating pathways as that happens. Wow.
So just to give a kind of concrete example, I mean, just think about the process of spiritual discernment and think about how many decisions we make on a daily basis that have to do with how we feel, with our anxieties, our fears. And, I was looking at this article that was New Advent had linked to it. And it talked about, what do I do if I don't feel the presence of God? And what do I do if I don't feel as if I'm certain that the faith is true? I mean, am I in sin? Do I continue forward? What do I need to do? And one helpful piece of knowledge, which is philosophical in nature, is to understand that, what is essential to you is your intellect and your will. Your emotions are not what dictate your true beliefs, your deepest inner core personality. They have to do with things such as whether or not your blood sugar is adequate. It has to do with whether or not you got adequate sleep. Your emotions are very much tied to, the current disposition of your body. And so when you feel as if you don't want to do the right thing, or if you feel as if you don't have a certitude that God exists and is watching over you, then you can take solace in the fact that that doesn't matter right now, because it's what I do with my intellect and my will that determine where I stand as far as if I'm moving forward in the faith and making progress in my spiritual life, not how I feel right now. Mm-hmm. And ideally, you would want to have your feelings aligned with what it is that you're doing and what you're seeking. But you have to realize that given the kind of thing that you are, this body-soul composite, which is just a truth of philosophy about who we are, that you're not always going to have that. And so that becomes an item of knowledge that you can use in moments of doubt, in moments of temptation, in moments of discernment.
Yeah.
And that's all of the philosophical nature. And it's the kind of thing that you can come to a deeper understanding of if you study some of the doctors of the church, like St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which can be so satisfying to be able to know something and to know it more and more as you test it, utilize it in even in opposition sometimes to feelings. I've often shared over the years with people who are maybe new to the faith or growing in faith, that the times when I was most in desolation and did not believe a word of it, but still chose through an act of my will, because he's proven to me again and again, I have data, and I've had moments of insight and connection, all those things in the past. I can choose in a moment of real darkness and desolation to say, Jesus, I trust in you. He knows I'm not emotionally feeling it or emotionally sincere about that at that moment. It's an act of my will based on thinking and data and experience and recall, all of the thinking and processing that has gone before that moment that allows me to overrule my feelings.
Yeah. In addition to that, there's also a way in which the mind can achieve rest when you have a concrete answer. right? When you remove uncertainty. So I had this experience. It was some years ago where I was part of my day job is I'm a facilities manager at our parish, and I was doing some cleaning inside the church, and so I get to focus on the altar, while I'm doing that, and sometimes it can become something that I do prayerfully.
Yeah.
And this was some years ago, and I realized I had this deep-seated resentment against someone, and that if I was honest with myself, I harbored ill will towards them, and I wanted them to get theirs for various reasons. And it took me back because I just said to myself, if I don't if this is still present in me, then I will not see God with this. I'm going to have to go to, it'll either be purgatory or the unthinkable, but this is an impediment between me and God. And I say, well, what does it mean that it comes up here now? And it's that God does nothing in vain. And so if I'm aware of this, then it means that God intends to do something about it. And if it's not something that's in my immediate power to fix, then I only have one recourse, and that's to hand it over to him in prayer and just trust, because God is not cruel, and he would not make me aware of this if he did not intend to fix it. And so there's a kind of reasoning that goes through this. I'm not thinking and trying to pray harder and trying to strangle these unpleasant thoughts and feelings with an additional thought to try to make myself feel better, like a palliative. But I'm saying, what do I know about who God is? What do I know about how he works? And that was the end of that. That was there I had reached rest.
I love that, connecting reason with rest, that you can say, this is logical, this makes sense. A friend of ours had a healing recently, and then a couple of us who left that home within a couple of days got sick. And I said to them, God didn't heal the lepers and then send them out and they were contagious to everyone else, but they were clean. So I don't believe that we caught what we caught from this person who had a healing, like we all got the flu, even though it may sound like a silly story, but it was this moment of reason where I said, no, that's not how God works. When he suddenly just completely removes illness from somebody, it's not just so that they can be secretly, like typhoid Mary or whatever, can be sharing it with others. There's a way to reason yourself to rest. That may be a silly example.
And again, we spend a lot of our time sort of intuitively feeling our way to things in the spiritual life. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it always has to be subordinate to reason. But in order to reason correctly, we have to have some kind of background knowledge about who I am, what is possible, who is God, how does he operate. And it's that interplay between being able to know some things about God and how he works, as handed down through the church and through tradition, and being able to apply it in your own case, that I think can be extremely beneficial. And because there are cases where in my own thought life and in speaking with others, where you struggle with things like guilt, obsessive thoughts, particularly people who suffer from scrupulosity. And oftentimes the solution to sort of the unpleasant and intrusive thoughts that come up in a situation like that is simply an act of reasoning, right? It's the application of reasoning. And an example, to give a concrete example of that, I was discussing this with somebody who struggles with these kinds of intrusive thoughts about their past life. And I just say to them, look, is there anything you should go through the following exercise? Ask yourself, is there anything that I can do about this right now? If the answer to that question is no, and is there anything that you need to repent of right now? Is there anything you need to do in the future as far as going to confession or making amends to somebody? And the answer to that question is no. Then it can't be of any possible benefit to you to continue to entertain the thought. And I think that one of the big causes of anxiety in a situation like that is to think, well, what if this is really God that is disturbing me? And there's something that I need to do, but I cannot figure out what it is. right?
Mm.
And I think that the many people who suffer from scrupulosity and some of these other sorts of disorders that can afflict people in the spiritual life often have those kinds of thoughts. And it's sounds counterintuitive, but it really is just reason that is the antidote to this, and that we have this God-given faculty for a reason, and that there are certain cases where we have to apply it.
Yeah, I love it.
That's what philosophy is the training and honing of that faculty.
Yeah. We have to take a short sponsor break to hear from our friends at Homeschool Connections, but we're going to be right back to hear more about approaching this topic and applying it in our lives. We're with Dr. Sam Nicholson talking about how anyone can study philosophy fruitfully. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Walter Crawford.
And I'm Maureen Whitman.
We are the co-founders of homeschoolconnections.com and proud sponsors of the Homeschooling Saints podcast,
which is here to help you homeschool more joyfully, more easily, and more effectively.
We want to thank you for listening.
And we invite you to check out our courses at homeschoolconnections.com.
And now, back to our program.
We're back with Dr. Sam Nicholson talking about how anyone can study philosophy fruitfully. So how should we get started?
Well, I think that the best place, so there's the what should you start with, and then there's the how do you approach it. And so I would say that with the what do you start with, you want to follow the mind of the church. And so there are certain people in history that the church has found profitable to promote, and those would be people like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine. I think that those two are probably the first two that I would look at if you're looking at studying philosophy. And then if you're going to move outside the realm of Christian philosophers to look at some of the, pagan philosophers of antiquity who nevertheless were able to discern certain things through the light of natural reason, even though we don't, claim they are sanctified or anything like that. Plato and Aristotle. There is much that is of value to be found in their writings. And so there's this very interesting book by a fellow named Lloyd Gerson. And what he writes about is what he calls the true conflict in philosophy. And the way that he sees it is that there is Christianity, and Catholicism most specifically, and its native conceptual environment, we might say, is the thought world that was forged in antiquity. Right, between the writings of Plato and Aristotle. Now, Plato and Aristotle are often canonically opposed to one another because they disagreed on many things. But there's a kind of continuum between the poles of their thinking where Christianity very comfortably and naturally fits. Right, it's very congruent with that way of viewing the world at a very basic level, and that the real division is not between the Platonists and the Aristotelians, or the Atomists and the Augustinians, but rather between that broad view of the world that was forged in antiquity and later synthesized in the Middle Ages, and modernity, which is a truncated understanding of what reality is. And that's what we see really promoted in the last 400 to 500 years. And so I would say that to get your bearings straight, those would be the most fruitful philosophers to begin studying. Now, the how is a little bit trickier because it's very difficult to pick up and read philosophy cold. It's not like reading history where you can just find a good historian and you can absorb the information just by sitting down and reading and thinking about it. And it's all pretty plain and accessible because it's a matter of factual information and maybe some analysis. There's a very highly specialized vocabulary that gets used. There are arguments, there are asides, there are terms that don't map neatly into ordinary language. And so you really need to find a reliable guide. And so I always recommend to people that you never try to just sit down and read one of these great philosophers cold, right? Just on your own initiative if you don't have a philosophical background, because you're apt to misunderstand certain key things. So what you want to do is pair that with someone who is a accessible and reliable guide, and fortunately there are many of them. So there's this volume that was put out by Word on Fire called Socrates Children, by Peter Kreeft, who many people will probably be familiar with. And it is unabashedly Catholic in its perspective, and it gives you a nice synoptic overview of all of the 100 of the great philosophers throughout history. And if you just go through that and you get a sort of executive summary, then you'll have a basic idea of what you're going to be reading when you pick it up and engage, either Plato or Aristotle or Aquinas or one of these other thinkers. If you're a little more ambitious, I would recommend getting, and this is for the very ambitious, Father Copleston's History of Philosophy. Now, Father Copleston wrote what is widely considered, even by secular academics, to be the most detailed, comprehensive, and complete overview of philosophy ever written, and that is his multi-volume history. And that would be something that is worth having in everyone's library. Although I will confess that, and I put myself in this category, the ratio of those who have purchased it and those who have completed it from start to finish is very, very, very high. There are many more people who have bought it than have completed it because it is just extremely dense and difficult to get through. But I would say that if those are two very, very good places to start, because they combine a sympathetic view of things, accessibility, and they are respected scholars. So you're not going to be getting some person's idiosyncratic, take on some of these thinkers. You're going to be getting, pretty much what every responsible scholar knows is the content of what they're saying.
Yeah, yeah. So having these resources, you mentioned Lloyd Gerson. Is that my
Lloyd
saying?
Gerson. That I think that's not really about any one philosopher, but I think it's a good sort of big picture sort of what is the key division in philosophy? What is it that is distinctive about modernity that puts it in opposition with religion? Right. Philosophically, what is it?
Okay.
And it's helpful because we as Catholics, we appropriate so many of these ideas that have come from outside the faith, like Plato and Aristotle, these pagan philosophers. And so I think that there's a venerable tradition to say that, part of what it means that Christ came in the fullness of time is that there was this enlightenment amongst the pagans and amongst the Gentiles through the light of natural reason. And this was not salvific. This did not give them, access to heaven or sanctification, but it did enable them to see certain truths about God and nature and morality that prepared them in time to receive the gospel at a later date. Right.
Wow.
And so even though there's much that is kind of hard-edged and is not necessarily compatible with Christianity, and Plato, for example, right, is teaching on, what is called metempsychosis, which is like a theory of reincarnation. Obviously, we don't follow him in things such as that. But there is also a lot about, for example, the necessity of taming the appetites, the necessity of following reason and not one's emotions. The fact that you, in order to contemplate higher and more noble truths, you cannot give yourself over to base desires like lust, right? These are things that are discerned through the natural light of reason. And then just with someone like Aristotle, just some of the basic conceptual structure of reality, right? That's a mouthful, but just the fact that, if you've ever heard the phrase formal or material, right? That distinction used in theology, like you say, someone's a formal heretic as opposed to a material heretic, that we're all at some level guilty of material heresy. We don't need to worry about it, right? That's a theological distinction. All of that just goes back to Aristotle. And just the mere fact that the church has found it useful to take some of these concepts and apply them in this way shows that he was onto something. He had really limbed something about the way the world works.
Mm. I love that sense of baptizing the good and then and kind of teasing out those threads and how do we apply them? What difference does it make in our lives? Would you mind taking it into that place? Like when we start to study philosophy and we start to get these pillars, it seems like, and I'm just calling them pillars because it seems to me that they become structures in our way of thinking that are very protective and guiding and help us to get to much higher levels.
Yeah. And so I think that some of this is we can work backwards from what we already know from, church teaching and tradition. right? So I mentioned, for example, some of these notions and concepts like formal, material, etc., and the fact that the church is seeing fit to apply them, and that we use terms, for example, in our creeds like substance, right? We say that the Father and the Son are the same substance, right? Consubstantial, right? Well, what is it? What is a substance? Well, there's an entire logic of that. And it means something very specific, and it's actually a technical term that comes from Aristotle, right? And so once you tease that out and come to a deeper understanding of it, you can begin to appreciate theological truths in a different way, right? And I just look at it as all the difference between you can set up an experiment with if you ever done one of those little high school experiments where you have the little balls that hit from side to side and you can watch them, you can observe that and get something out of it. But if you know physics, then you're going to have a deeper appreciation of what exactly you're seeing. And I think the same thing is true with philosophy, because I've always used this analogy that philosophy is to theology as math is to science, to the sciences, which is that it's just going to deepen in your appreciation of what you're looking at.
Yeah, and I feel like when you practice mentally kind of running on the rails of truth and logic, then you're able to identify what's off the rails. It's like when we talk about an ad hominem attack or something like that, we're talking about someone going outside of logic, going off the rails to try to make a non-logical argument that attacks the person instead of the topic itself or the argument. And so I just want to say that not only can we go higher within ourselves, but we can also distinguish the lies. We can see the false or subversive strategies that are going on around us and think more clearly and perceive more clearly. Feels like it's all tied to spiritual sight as well.
It is, because think about what you're doing just through like just think about what it is to use a fallacy, right? Like the ad hominem fallacy. So, and again, not every attack on the person is actually an ad hominem fallacy, right? If someone really does not know what they're talking about, then that's irrelevant. But one way to look at it is to say that, well, look, if I were seeking your good, then I would want you to arrive at the truth. And the facts about you that you're ugly or dumb or smell bad or whatever have you that I'm calling attention to, that has nothing to do with the truth. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to change your mind, but I don't care if you're getting the truth out of this or not. So what you can see is that the use of a fallacy, it just might be like, okay, it's not just a faux pas, it's that I'm trying to dominate you in a way that's indifferent to your good. Something really wrong with that.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to reach you through your reason that I'm not willing your good.
Yeah. That's a really powerful distinction. So it's not just, you're using this technique, which is not logical. It's you are morally.
Is that I don't care all I want to do is change your mind. I don't care if I'm moving you to the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a lack of respect, the cornerstone of appreciating human dignity as being given by God. Yeah. So what else is important for us to say to just equip our listeners to begin, Sam? What do we really need?
Just, start, not everyone, the beauty of it is that not everyone has to take an interest in philosophy or study it. There are some people, it is not for everyone. I think everyone can benefit from it, but that doesn't mean that it's for everyone. But if you are interested in it, then think of some one topic, where you've had questions and you don't have rest, you don't feel like you've gotten a good answer, and maybe just start to pursue that. So use the momentum of your own inclinations to get into it. Start with what is just part of your own, the fabric of your own psychic makeup, right? Your own curiosity. Use that to propel you into inquiry and wanting to explore something more deeply. And then look at what a trusted and reliable source has said about it. And then just see where it goes from there.
Yeah. No, I love that.
I know that my own studies in philosophy simply came from not having a deep conviction that God existed, or rather God and the soul, right? Because it was really more just the question of the soul existed, and that there was something very wrong with this idea that I was just an aggregate of atoms with no spiritual component. But I had not for the life of me a way to prove it or argue that. And so that's what set me examining some of these questions.
Yeah. So you start to scratch the itch that the Holy Spirit has provided, essentially.
There you go.
All right. Something to take into our prayer lives. What else should we leave our listeners with as we're starting to wrap up, Dr. Nicholson?
Yeah, well, I would just encourage, not only adults to study this, but also to try to expose, I don't want to say young children to it necessarily. You want them to just accept things without questioning for a certain period of time. But, particularly high school aged kids. I think in a perfect world, no one at that age would have to study philosophy. And I know that there are some instructors who think that it's really not appropriate to study it until later. And in a way, I think there's something to be said for that, right? Simply because we are not fully integrated between our reason and our emotional lives until we're in our mid-20s, right? That's not, just as a fact about our neurophysiology. So we're more apt to be swayed by emotional reasoning and by, our appetites. And so there is a danger to studying philosophy at that tender age. But I also think that there's an equal and opposite danger, which is that they're going to be bombarded with bad ideas and false ideas, many of which are very seductive and have a lot of social clout behind them. And they've got to have something internal to them by which they can push back against it. And so I think that it would be a good idea to just start introducing them to, reliable and trusted philosophical sources. And maybe looking at some of these topics as they come up, right? Because you don't want to give them the impression that we must run away afraid of them, but that rather we've got 2,000 years of history and tradition of some of the best minds that have ever lived to combat them with.
All right. Well, folks, check out Dr. Sam Nicholson's page at Homeschool Connections. We're linking to it in the show notes, but it's very easy to just go to the Homeschool Connections website, click the drop down on About Us, and look at faculty and search for him there. Always great courses, popular courses. Anything in particular you'd like to plug that's coming up? We're going to be airing this episode kind of early spring. So what's next for you?
Yeah, well, currently I'm teaching I'm currently teaching a dual enrollment course with Franciscan University called The Human Person. And so that's a kind of breakneck pace through Western philosophy from Socrates all the way up to the contemporary era. It's broken into 2 parts. And high schoolers can take it for college credit if they pass the Franciscan exam. And so I'm currently teaching the second part of that. I think I will be teaching it again in the fall. I highly recommend it. I think it makes for a very good introduction to philosophy. I also have in recorded course a number of logic classes, and just for cultivating the ability to reason well, there's just no substitute for training in logic.
Wonderful. All right. Dr. Sam Nicholson, we can't thank you enough. I think we got a really good head start on how anyone can study philosophy and really have it bear fruit in our lives. Thank you so much for taking time today.
Yep.
All right. Thank you to all our listeners. We really appreciate your tuning in. We're praying for you. Please pray for us too. God bless you and have a great day. And that's our show for today. Our program is sponsored by homeschoolconnections.com. Be sure to subscribe to Homeschooling Saints and leave us an honest review. God bless you, and thank you for joining us.